And we were just waiting for people to join. Welcome to this evening's author chat with Dr. Eloise Epstein. We'll begin shortly as soon as we get verification from the incomparable Tina Noble in the background, who is the producer of the show. All right.
All right, so I believe you can get started. Others will be coming in shortly, but have a great discussion, guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina. And welcome to the author chat featuring Dr. Eloise Epstein. We're going to be talking about her book, and I want to get this right: Trade Wars, Pandemics, and Chaos: How Digital Procurement Enables Business Success in a Disordered World. But before we get to Dr. Eloise, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping chores. To begin the 90-minute section, we've broken it down to 3 segments. The first is going to be an overall, what you call a high-level conceptual discussion regarding some of the key points in the book, which you've all received by now, I would imagine. The second segment for the next 30 minutes will be industry impact. What impact does the findings from the book and general discussion have from an industry perspective? And finally, in the last segment, we're going to deal with the impact on you as an individual procurement professional. Now, I want to stress that this is truly an interactive event. So throughout the entire discussion, I've got discussion points set up. We have them ready. We encourage you to raise your hand, and Tina will be taking you on an orderly basis so that you can come online. And if you don't want your picture showing, that's fine. You don't need video. We can disable that. But to talk and ask questions of Dr. Epstein in terms of what we're talking about here in relation to the book. And we would encourage you to do that throughout the entire evening. Again, this is an interactive experience, and we want you to get the most of your time with Eloise. In the meantime, without further delay, let's turn to Dr. Eloise Epstein. Welcome. Glad you're here.
Thank you for having me. I'm quite happy to be here. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while.
Well, I'm sure we all have. And let's start right out of the gate. One of the things that I read from your book is, more than any other enterprise function, and I want to be right on this quote, procurement has grown from back office cost control to strategic business partner. Now, in framing this, we've been talking about this for years, maybe 10, 15, 20 years, about procurement is strategic and we're no longer an adjunct of the finance department in the back end. What's changed through this chaotic time, or the changes that are happening, that is going to facilitate or accelerate that?
Yeah, so a few things have changed. One, first and foremost, and consultants have been espousing this, we've got to be strategic. We've got to do strategic procurement. We've been espousing this for over a decade. But what was lacking was the data, the analytics, the technology to actually make this happen. And we've seen PowerPoint, if I can go back 10 years or longer in my PowerPoint archives and see slides that talk about be strategic, don't do that tactical stuff. But what happened is we put in these systems, which I'm sure I will drag the source to pay providers a number of times tonight, but we put in these systems assuming that they would take care of all the transactions. We would operationalize all these contracts that we negotiated and sourced and whatnot. And that didn't happen. So we started to have to firefight, and then more broadly BPO, or set up these global business service type functions to essentially fix what digital didn't deliver, or the technology did not deliver. So that's kind of one piece. And then the other piece is the world changed and the way businesses operate has changed. We do a lot more M&A now, even whether you're a Fortune 500 company or the increasing number of private equity ownership companies. Between those two, the way businesses operate has changed. And then, of course, risk/ESG has come barreling is probably too understated of a term, has come just exploding onto the market, where companies are asking, is my product sustainable? Is the supplier, or are my suppliers operating in a sustainable way? Am I employing diverse or engaging with diverse suppliers? On and on and on. And the reality is a lot of any corporation's sustainability and social responsibility goals runs through the financial, the checks that we write, or the electronic checks that we write. So all of this came together over the last 3 or 4 years. And so I've even gone farther since the book. We're not just a partner to the business, we are the business. And I'm very bullish about that. And that's important to remember, is the work that we do that I've just described and beyond, it is the business. We are key to the business, not just a separate entity.
Well, I see that's an interesting point, because one of the questions we often get about this is, how do we become strategic within the organization? Like, organizations have to be ready for being strategic. How do you become strategic if you haven't been, if you've worked in an organization that's been tactical or functional or transactional? What do you do? What advice do you give to somebody in that regard?
Well, and we'll get to this when it gets to skills towards the end, but certainly as procurement, the leaders in procurement, well, the one thing we have is data. If we engage with 10,000 suppliers, 30,000 suppliers, 50,000 suppliers, that's a tremendous amount of data. That's a tremendous amount of influence that we can have. It's also a tremendous amount of risk that those suppliers bring to our organization. To be able to tell that story and elevate that and make change through those 50,000 suppliers, we don't need permission for that. That's our job. That's our opportunity. And so as we do that, then there is certainly, how do we tell that story? And there's different ways to do that. How do we level up? And this goes for the procurement leaders themselves, all the way down to the junior person that just entered out of college or grad school. So it's what's the story we're telling, and how do we tell it? Because there's nothing holding us back.
No, but that begins at the top, though. Is that a safe bet to say, in terms of becoming strategic, the organization has to be able to change? How does somebody change from, leadership from where they are? Let's say change an organization's approach from a tactical or transactional basis. I mean, that's a challenge, isn't it? I mean, organizations have to, filter this down from the top. There has to be a firm commitment to that, isn't there?
Well, okay, so I'll answer it a couple different ways. So I highlighted BT sourced, British Telecom's procurement function, which just got spun out as a separate company in my book. And think about British Telecom. That they're sort of like the equivalent of AT&T here in the States. It's not, you don't equate AT&T on the same level as Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon. It's not disparaging them, just it's not the same. And so imagine an old line company like BT or even AT&T or whomever, really doesn't matter. But BT has able, Cyril, the leader there, the chief procurement officer, has been able, he said, I'm going to build this entity, and we are going to innovate, and we're going to drive the business, and we're going to partner with the business, and we're going to operate like we are part of the business. And Cyril has done that. Now, what I would say, since this is semi-private, is, and it's implied in the book, but not explicit, is we have a lot of weak leaders in procurement today. That's a secret that we sort of talk about in hushed tones, and we sort of whisper it to one another. But the reality is we have a lot of weak leaders, and the leaders themselves need to level up, or they're going to get bypassed. And that's increasingly, we're seeing this, because there's an anecdote in the front part of the book about I'm talking about two different women that are younger, and I'm watching them in real time. That it's based on two women that are in my network, and I'm watching them. One works for a pharma company, another for a CPG company. I'm watching them just go scaling right up they're going to be CPOs within, I would have estimated 3 to 5 years, but I would say 1 to 3 years. So, I mean, it's on the leadership front, it's like either move forward or get out the way, because there's a bunch of people like nipping at your heels.
Well, now I want to turn to the studio audience or the audience there. Do you have a question for Dr. Epstein? Please feel free to ask in terms of where your organization is and how you can progress forward. And we want to delve in a little bit further. One of the things you mentioned in the book is procurement practitioners are at the forefront of innovation, sustainability and social responsibility, making change by directing where and how enterprises spend their money, i.e. follow the money. That's what you mentioned in the book. Now, one of the first things that came to my mind in regards to that is that the difference between public and private sector. Public sector has always looked at spend as being a useful tool to drive economic development, social responsible procurement. Traditionally, private sector hasn't been in that same realm. What's changed now in terms of that? Is this only applied to the public sector, or does it also include the private sector?
I think that balance has shifted. I think it's now increasingly, especially as the public sector gets highly politicized, and we can just leave that there. But in the private sector, it's clear that you are not going to be buying. Consumers are making it very clear they're not going to buy products with palm oil. The products that use, for the most part, use forced labor or conflict minerals. Now, we all have iPhones, and I think we all kind of look the other way when it comes to that. So I think we have a long way to go. But in general, what has changed is predominantly social media. I don't think, I think it's fair to say everybody has seen that video. That video that gets you to stop eating products, honey products, or that product that, again, palm oil, that sort of viral video that goes, and it doesn't matter what it is, and it's hit a crescendo last year with the George Floyd murder, and where all of a sudden we had to ask some very difficult questions, and it forced corporations to step into the fray, and it became a mainstream conversation. And when you ask the enterprise what it is they're doing to support Black lives, or to support queer people, or whatever the social cause is, that you also have to look predominantly at the suppliers, because remember, follow the dollar. And the other piece is even if you're a tier, if you're the brand and your tier 4 supplier is the one for, cutting down rainforests or doing whatever, lighting the lake on fire with chemical, pouring chemicals into lakes, the tier 4 supplier is going to survive. It's the brand that takes the hit. It's the brand that takes the forced labor hit. So,
and that's a generational thing, isn't it? Because I remember IBM came out with a study about 4 or 5 years ago saying that the up and coming generations are asking the tough questions about product sourcing that we never asked I certainly not in my generation understood to ask, but now they're expecting more. And that's really where the shift is coming in, is what you're saying, right?
Well, yeah, and they're demanding it. And by the way, we have a lot greater transparency, and they have more optionality. So I can go buy I'm picking on Nestle because it's the only candy bar I can think of, but I can also, Facebook through its advertisements will figure out that I am vegan. And so they'll start pushing products that are small, local, organic, whatever. And in response, of course, you see the big brands. Cosmetics have been doing this for a number of years, buying up these smaller companies, and they just keep coming, and it's cyclical. And you see the big CPG companies, they're growing through by setting up these subsidiaries that are amalgamations of these small entities. So to answer your question, there was a convoluted answer, but in short, it was. There's more options, and it's easier, and we have that, like Facebook and Google and Twitter and now TikTok bring that front and center to
the socialization of procurement. We have a question from the previous. What is your definition of the best procurement leader?
It's somebody that establishes a culture of innovation, and by that I mean does not punish failure. And I heard this quote this morning from Kevin Frechette at Fair Market. So I'm just quoting him properly. But if you're not breaking things, you're not doing it. You're not working aggressively enough. And I think that applies to good procurement leadership. Enabling a good procurement leader enables and hires people that want to match their vision, and then that requires setting a very aggressive vision. And I work with a lot of the quote unquote leaders. I of course don't particularly care for that term, but the Cyrils from BT of the world, they're not anchored to the past. There's another retail company that I work with, the CPO there, brand new organization starting from scratch and hiring all new people. And in this case, he's not hiring category managers. He's giving them data. He's giving them tools and their resources. They'll source cheese one day and facilities the next day and IT software the next day. And they can do that because he's not fixed in that old ideology. And it's so those are 4 key things. And the other is to, again, think like the business. This is not, I don't need to shake the supplier for a couple of nickels or thump them over the head. I need to think more broadly. How is this going to impact the business? Because especially in the bigger companies, our suppliers become our customers. And so there's oftentimes these balance of trade questions. And so if you're, I don't know, Apple, your suppliers, you will be selling to your suppliers as much, and vice versa, or Google or whomever. And so I think there's probably like 5 or 6 things in there, but these are the things that make it a good leader.
Okay, so let's tie it back, because I'll tell you, we could go off on a whole segment on data modernization and creating the culture for that. But one of the other things you mentioned within the pages, you talk about finding a blueprint for approaching the complexity of procurement and making smart technology investments. And when we talk about smart technology, I'm reminded of the Deloitte survey from 2019, where the majority of CPOs of this global survey said they are not happy with the outcome or the results of their digital transformation strategy. I know you're familiar with that. We've talked about it beforehand. What is this blueprint? How does this blueprint look that you're referring to in the book?
Well, the short answer is these all of this, the best in class strategies that were these transformations that were foisted upon these organizations, however they were foisted. You have to throw them out. Like, they're not relevant. They're not relevant in today's day and age. And my argument is very simple. You should be onboarding new capabilities in 3 to 6 weeks, or you're doing it wrong. If you're waiting 18 months to 3 years or 5 years, it's not going to work. And you're going to be gone. And I write about this, that you see this churn of leaders, of CPOs, either before or right after the implementation of an S2P system, because I think everybody by that point realizes it's not going to work. And so they're avoiding the collateral damage. And I usually I get brought in right at that precipice.
Right at the balancing act.
Yeah, exactly. And so my argument is very simple. Quit hiring consultants to tell you how to do a digital transformation. I want every one of you to be able to have the information and the skills to do that digital transformation. And I give you as much as I have in the book. And, this is why I love the Procurement Foundry. There's a whole community of people to extend the book. And my premise is that, what's probably more implicit is, you don't need a consultant to do a 5-year transformation or a 3-year transformation. Go do it yourselves. And again, you don't need permission. You can just do it. The only people that win with these big multi-year complex transformations are the tech vendors, the consultants, and indirectly or semi-directly the analysts. So
the old ERP days. Let's get to Khaled Merched, who has a question for you. Tina, did you want to turn his mic on? There you go. Hello, Khaled.
Yeah,
how are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you, John?
Just fine, thank you. Looking forward to your question.
Sure, thanks. And well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Epstein, for taking the time to do this with us. I actually wanted to go back to that first topic of how do we make sure that we're viewed as a strategic partner to the business or as the business, right? And the company I work for Novozymes. We're a biotech company, and we do have a decent strategic level of sourcing. But what we're seeing now is because throughout the pandemic, we've done, if I might say so, such a good job in securing supply. Like you say in your book, to our grit and commitment, not because of that we have the structure to support that, right? But procurement has done such a good job to secure supply that now the business is seeing, well, we were able to navigate the pandemic and navigate the disruptions without having to do any changes to supply or to procurement. So why should we fix what's broken? And we just announced a new strategy, fantastic new strategy, but it doesn't put supply in the forefront. And now what I'm seeing with my colleagues is, hey, okay, yeah, we were able to secure supply in these disruptions, but we don't want to keep doing this as a day-to-day business, right? So it feels like we're missing that we're not being a strategic partner. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'm going to answer it I'm going to answer in two parts. The first is an anecdote from the book: is if you get invited to the table, what are you bringing to the table? And we have data, and I've sort of enumerated that a few minutes ago. That's what we can bring. We can bring information on the supply market, but I would also sort of expand the thinking to, it's not just the source, right? Or it's not ensuring enough source material. I imagine however many suppliers you have a fair amount of risk, and you probably have risk you don't realize, not you, but like that's hidden in the background. And these are the forward-looking things you should be looking at, and you can actually do that without the business. You can look because I imagine maybe you're looking at financial risk, maybe you're looking at cyber risk, but maybe not. Maybe you're not looking close enough. Maybe you're looking at sort of operational risk or event risk, because is all your manufacturing plants, I'm assuming you manufacture, how are they set up? And that we see this with the microprocessor. We saw this early with microprocessing processors, constraint on supply last year because everything was in one area in China. And so there are broader supply market issues at play. And I point all of this out is because if you wind the clock back to 2019, nobody in their forward-looking supply assurance was thinking, well, what happens if a pandemic hits and wipes out, so like you have this cascade of shutdowns. And so I think being able to model what could happen is really where you take it to the next level. And so I would encourage you to look at take a step back and look at your end-to-end supply chain. And this is what consultants do. And figure out where there are likely to be breaks or disruptions, and then bring solutions to the table. And that's the beauty of what I love about supply chain operations. And by the way, risk, 90% of your risk, maybe more, comes through your third parties. So we're really talking about third-party management, not just insurance source of supply. So does that help
answer your question?
Yeah,
it does. It really does. And I like that idea of modeling what would happen should some sort of disruption come to play. So yeah,
and just on the way out, or on the way sort of to close this question, this is where simulation tools come in. And this is a concept that is only the most advanced companies are doing, but I would argue everybody needs to be doing. This is why I say we have to get out of this transactional, because when you feed all of your variables into a simulation and visualize it, it's super compelling. So that's another angle to take. When I talk about the wind farm in the book, that we did a simulation, and you see the windmills and you see the corresponding changes, variable changes. And that's when you hook people. I mean, that because we've become a visual society. So the more visual you can make these things, the more impact you have.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dwight. You know, as I'm listening to your description there, it's a lot of moving parts, isn't it now? I mean, you talk about what we discussed at the very beginning, you know, the strategic, moving from backroom to strategic, needing the right leadership in place, the blueprint and having that in place and taking some ownership for your blueprint. I mean, that all comes in. How does that segue into, and we only got a couple of minutes left for this segment. In the book, you talk about the significant organizational implications of digital done well and with success measures, watchouts, and innovations in the offing. One of the things when you talk about these, and we've talked about digital done well, success measures, watchouts, what do you mean by that?
Well, I alluded to three of them earlier:
Right.
consultants, tech providers, and
Those are
analysts.
watchouts. Okay.
Those are big watchouts. But there are other watchouts in terms of ceding your authority to the CIO. And there's also watchouts to ceding too much authority to the startups or the tech provider. You know, as much as I'm a big proponent of startups and all of this, there's no substitution for there's no excuse for not having good data. So it all starts there. So that's a big watch out. But also the second part is skills. And oftentimes we get ourselves into trouble because we don't have the skills. And when I was younger in my career, I did a lot of arm waving because I didn't have all the skills that I used buzzwords and jargon in lieu of actually having the deep expertise and skills. And when we have the skills and expertise, then it's sort of like the Matrix at the end of the first Matrix, where Neo, like all of a sudden, everything comes into focus and he sees the sort of the construct of the Matrix. When you have the knowledge, then the constructs of everything come into play, and you start to see all of your procurement operations, all of your supply chain operations in a whole new way. And that's why I give every piece of information I have, or at least that I can get out of my head, to everybody, because I want to elevate our collective competency in this. Because I think as a profession, if we don't do that, then we're just destined to go back to being a back office function. And I refuse to let that happen. So those are a couple of watch outs, but more importantly, or to summarize, maybe a better way is be in control of your own destiny. I've watched generations of people be at the whim of other people's decisions, and that we don't have to do that anymore. And so we should stop doing that.
Okay, so and that's how it'll enable, and the closing excerpt for this first part is, will enable businesses to not only be prepared, but to thrive when confronted with tomorrow's disruption. I mean, that's the segue that leads into that ultimate outcome.
Well, and that was Kali's question a little bit too, is what do you do? Like, how do you change the business to sort of look in preparation for that next disruption? Because by the way, the next disruption is coming. And I'll tell you that my prediction, and I'm very, very out on record on this, is we're going to have a massive cyber attack that takes down large chunks of our digital infrastructure. And that's already happened in the Ukraine a couple of years ago. And that was just a dry run, and it's going to hit at least America, if not the Western European nations. So what happened? So we spent all this time decentralizing from offices, work from home, which is great in the pandemic. But what happens when all of our digital communication gets cut? And I think and so even if I'm wrong, how many of us are wargaming that possibility? What would we do? I can think of pretty much most IT organizations would be caught completely flat-footed. And I don't care about the internal IT, I care about the supplier IT, because think about how devastating that would be for your suppliers.
Well, and this was
All right,
one.
now, yeah,
That was
I'll let you
one
get on
note,
to
though. That was one note, though, that I think is worth noting about your suppliers, because apparently, according to a number of research, that 52% or 55% of all third-party breaches into an enterprise occur to a third-party partner or through a supplier. The vulnerability is significant, and most organizations do not know how protected their data is down their supply line. And
Exactly.
worse yet, some don't even believe that it's their responsibility at this stage to know that.
Well, and not only that, who has responsibility for fixing that or securing that? And by the way, I would also argue we don't even understand the level of that risk, because you could have, and this is research I'm working on now, which we'll talk about, I know, in a little bit, but there's the devices, anything with electronics deep in your supply chain can get compromised and you wouldn't even know it, whether it's fish or sort of commodity type things or electronics. And so you have or vaccines. So you have risk that's coming from your suppliers in greater numbers. I think that 52% is low, because increasingly when you look at an end-to-end supply chain, it's predominantly third parties, not so much in planning, but obviously in source, and increasingly manufacturing, co-packing, logistics, 3PL, warehouses, and so forth. That's all suppliers, and that's your suppliers. So think about the amount of risk just flooding into your organization.
See, the thoughts are just coming because dwell time is on average 6 months, they say, and it takes 6 months to actually know you've been breached and another 90 days to respond. Can you imagine the level of damage that can be done in that time period? I mean,
we're already seeing that. I mean, look at Home Depot, Best Buy, Target. Those breaches came in through suppliers, through supplier portals. Think about everybody has a supplier portal, quote unquote. Think about how insecure those are and how easy, let me just sort of spoiler warning, they're very easy to breach. And I can just go in and change the banking details, and I can, siphon off $100K or $1 million payment. And now you've got and that's a fairly unsophisticated attack. And it just goes up from there, and so, yeah, but the crown jewels is going in and taking all that customer data and all of those credit card numbers, because the reputational damage, we all remember Home Depot and Best Buy and Target for an ignominious reason. So
this is a perfect segue into segment 2 of our show, which is this, and there's so much more to procurement today. Innovation, digital transformation, introducing new products and services, not to mention other factors such as climate change, geopolitical stability, increasing societal expectations, and world health. Now, this was from the Deloitte 2021 CPO survey, but you've talked about that at length. So let's start looking at it from the industry now. We've sort of set the framework of the old foundation of procurement and where we have to get to. How do we get into these different areas? How do we prioritize? I mean, when you think of procurement, you don't naturally think of geopolitical stability. At least you used to not think of that. You wouldn't think of climate change. At least you wouldn't used to think of it. But now you have to. How do organizations begin to make that move towards procurementizing? I don't even know if that's a word, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
These areas that you highlight as being important.
Well, I mean, again, so your source material, your commodities all the way up, these questions are getting asked. They're tough questions. And there are investigative journalists that are just pulling this stuff out randomly. So getting ahead of this is like step 1 or maybe step 2, but it's going to come. Like if you have palm oil in your products, you're going to get tagged with that. If you are using a supplier like AT&T just got tagged with supporting candidates that just passed that very restrictive reproductive rights abortion bill in Texas. AT&T is having to answer some very difficult questions, and it's not hard to see that that's just the top level. But what if you calculated AT&T support, gives 80% of its hardware business to suppliers that also support politicians that are anti-reproductive health, or that other sort of politically charged issues. That blows back on the company. Again, it doesn't blow back on the individual suppliers. And so AT&T has been said, hey, we support people on both sides. It's a very tepid response. But it's just one step to further, it's just one step to the side to calculate all those suppliers. Who are your big hardware suppliers or your big whatever? And all of a sudden you become the subject of the nightly news. And I guarantee you no Fortune 500 company wants that press. AT&T didn't want it and they stumbled into it. And so getting in front of this stuff is critical, or the reverse is after the George Floyd killing. How do we embrace diverse suppliers, and how do we show that we're working with communities? And one company, Starbucks, has done a really good job. And every time they've been criticism has been lobbed at them, they can in return talk about in very clear metrics saying, hey, this percentage of, we hire this many people, this, we use these types of suppliers, we use these types of products. And by the way, we're continually evaluating. So if you look closely at Starbucks in particular, they're actually ahead of the curve. And these are the types of conversations that procurement at least can be part of. I was talking to the CPO of a hotel chain, and she was saying that, the hotel chain wanted to get rid of plastic straws, go with the paper straw that I have here. And the operations people didn't know how to do that. So they came to the procurement people. They didn't know where to find the supplier. Well, all of a sudden now you are a supplier and helping to solve the business problem of making the business more green. On and on and on, whether it's janitorial supplies that are green and so forth. And I've gotten wildly off topic and on my soapbox here, but I think the point is if you summarize on what I said a little while ago, is you have the data, you bring the data to the conversation. Our job is to know our suppliers. Our job is to understand the supply markets. And our job is to understand who can deliver what capability at what quality and what price. When you break it down to that and you fulfill those objectives, you can do all of those ESG goals.
Well, now, one of the things, and if you're just joining us, if you have any questions for Dr. Epstein, I encourage you to ask, because this is an insightful conversation. One of the things I want to touch on when you talk about diversity and George Floyd, going back to the late 60s, diversity came about as a result of the riots in Detroit. The automotive industry was the first to do it. There was a great deal of commitment made to be able to move in that direction. And yet it became somewhat static. How do you gain traction on these areas? Like if we're talking with the people joining us today, reading your book, they're going to say, these are all important factors that are going to come. How do we pick and choose which ones are the ones that are going to, I hate to use the word, but stick and gain traction? Which ones are going to go, when the immediate crisis is over, back into the old, well, we're going to just revert to the way we've done it before. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, there is an organizational stasis that happens that brings everything back to center, if you will. I can't think of a better word. And then nobody does anything. But I also think, so on one hand, I think we have employees that are younger, that are more socially conscious. So it's not just consumers, but employees are wanting to drive this conversation, and they're choosing to where they sign up to be employed based on these conversations. But the other piece is that the political headwinds do change, and they change very dramatically. But my question, and back to you, is why wouldn't you use 100% of your suppliers? Why wouldn't they be diverse? Like, what would prevent you from doing that? And the standard answer is, well, they cost more, or they wouldn't deliver as high a quality. But we don't know that. That is an assumption. That's a false assumption based on flawed data, flawed hypotheses from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because the data proves it out now that by going with diverse suppliers or adding diverse suppliers to the mix, you actually get better quality and cheaper prices or more competitive prices. And so it becomes an excuse. And this is, I'm really big on blowing up these excuses. There's no excuse for 100% of your spend should go, at least where there's suppliers that are qualified, should go out to diverse suppliers. And so, and the reason we go back to this hypothesis, this flawed hypothesis, is because we haven't been able to find the suppliers, much less quantify them or be able to figure out, associate those who's diverse with what's the spend. And if you look since June of last year, there has been a mad scramble. And by the way, just we have started to the momentum behind corporations supporting Black Lives Matter has waned a lot in the last year. And you have to look really hard because people are throwing their hands up and saying, well, I can't find the diverse suppliers, blah, blah, blah. But that's an excuse. That's another excuse. Sorry, I'm getting on my soapbox, but I'll get off this in a second. But I talk about having a strong data foundation. This is where digital helps. You have a strong foundation and you have a tool that actually, you have golden records for all your suppliers and they're enriched. And if you see my spider chart, I have Tealbook, which does this. And there's no excuse because all the information you need, everything I just described is right there at your fingertips. So why do you not invite 100% diverse suppliers to your sourcing events? Anyway, sorry.
I'm sorry. I think it's important what you're saying but here's the thing with data, and data is so important. We keep coming back to this. Only 5% of all data captured is ever analyzed, and 55% remains dark data. So to do this, it's almost like if we look at, let's say, supplier diversity and the impact of that is you're because of poor data quality, you're stuck perpetually in it's the right thing to do, but is it the smart thing to do? And what you're saying is if you get your data in line, you're going to see that it's not only the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and that 5% number drives me bananas. It's unacceptable. I walk in and I walk into every CPO and I talk to a lot of CPOs and I challenge them because I know they all have bad data, because I'll say, you have bad supplier data, don't you? And they'll say, yeah, oh, it's a mess. And I'll say, that's unacceptable. I refuse to accept that. There are tools there are tools that will solve that problem. The only reason you're not doing that is because you haven't put the effort behind it. And if you are not the CPO, if you're the director or all the way down to the beginning, it starts with you and this desire for data. Think about if I were to go get an entry-level job at Netflix or Amazon, or maybe not exactly entry level, but if I go, all the folks, I mean, I'm here in the Bay Area, I can go right down to Netflix or Google or Amazon. And the first thing when I on board is I get access to their massive set of data, because the whole point, those companies thrive through innovation driven by the data that they have. And as an employee, they will hire me because I have an interest in data. I have a love of data. I'm not afraid of data. And John, you and I are of a generation where most of the people in our generation are scared of data. And we did not grow up with data. We grew up with, again, false assumptions, hyperbole, and God knows what else. But we are in an era where data is critical, and we've seen it swing elections. We've seen it transform businesses. We've seen ourselves become data for harvesting. So I think we have to change this mindset. That 5%, there is one thing that has to change. That has to be 95% ASAP tomorrow, because until we do that, we are kicking the can down the road and perpetuating these fallacies.
Now, is that part of the blueprint? And we talked about earlier in the first
Yeah.
segment, the blueprint of getting data. Because if I'm looking at all these areas, geopolitical stability, I want to touch on that and expand a little bit. We touch a little bit on climate change and societal expectations. We've even touched on that. I'm not sure about the World Health, but I want to get into that a little bit in these different areas. But it's an act of will. It's creating a culture for data, isn't it? Organizations have to, from the top, recognize and create a data culture to be able to embrace it. Otherwise, we're going to continue to fly blind because we've got more information coming in than we ever had before. I mean, what advice do you give to organizations who come to you and say, well, we're going to leave the data with a service provider that they're going to take care of it, or we're going to go and look at an outside consultant? What do you say to organizations like that to get their data in order? I mean, I don't know the audience where they are in their data. Certainly ask questions if you have any with regards to that, but how do you get them on the right track? I mean,
Well,
what do you do?
questions. Ask questions, otherwise Eloise is going to get on her soapbox and continue to rant and rave. I mean, there are how you actually execute it, whether you hire a consultant to do it, whether you have your IT group do it, who does it, it doesn't really matter. We have to be able to define what the end state is. And too often we don't. Procurement, like this is, I'll go slightly off topic to get to this point. Like, for procurement, you need a data lake, a procurement data lake. And so every time I say this to CPO, they'll say, well, IT has a data lake. And I said, I'm sure they do. And you probably haven't told them what you need in your data lake. Yeah, that's right. And why not? That's your data lake. You have to take ownership of it. So your supplier data, your material data, that's your data. You have to take ownership of it. And I know, look, it's not, I like to sort of allude that it's a magic wand. It's not a magic wand. I know especially in large enterprises with many ERP systems, 30, 100, 200 ERP systems, I know it's not trivial. But that's not an excuse to not do it, because there are sophisticated technologies that accelerate this and that drive this forward much faster, especially if you can take your tier 1 suppliers and then your tier 2 and then your tier 3. You don't have to do it for every supplier if you have 50,000 suppliers, obviously you're not going to do it for all 50,000, but there is absolutely no excuse that you cannot tell me, and I'll tee up your geopolitical, you cannot tell me what the single golden record that you have for every tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 supplier, all their subsidiaries, all their locations, all their diversity information, all their sustainability, all their capabilities, and all their locations, so that we can map all of that to financial risk, location risk, and cyber risk, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And oh, by the way, all of that should connect to our contracts and our sourcing and whatnot. But see, I told you to get on my soapbox.
No, that's what we need. We need the soapbox discussion here.
Because that's how you start to, when a certain president enacts very aggressive tariffs and sort of instigates a trade war. Well, like, you have to be able to understand or you have a pandemic that's rolling across different geographies. You have to be able to look and see, wait, what's going to shut down and what's the impact here? And we've all learned this and done this and responded to this by hand and throwing people at it over the last year, but we don't have to throw people at this anymore.
How do we move from a reactive mode? Because I'm just thinking that in the first segment, we talked about the foundation again. Now we're getting into getting the organization ready. But how do we get ahead of it from a react mode to a proactive mode? I mean, you mentioned that there is something that's going to come. There's going to be maybe another pandemic, another crisis that's going to come. And there's that old saying that generals are always fighting the last battle and they're not ready for the new one. I mean, in terms of reading your book, it causes you to think ahead in regards to that. How do people deal with, again, anticipating geopolitical stability or instability? How do they anticipate? I mean, changes in weather patterns, things along those lines. I remember one company tied into the weather network to try to anticipate if bad weather was going to interrupt the shipping channels. I mean, how do you move from that react mode to a proact mode?
Well, and how do you predict a container ship's going to get stuck in the middle of the Suez Canal and
Exactly.
disrupt? The reality is you can't predict everything, and there are lots of prognosticators, probably myself included, that are talking about various pieces of this. But it doesn't really matter what the disruption is. What matters, what's at the heart of this is, do you have your data? Do you know what your contingency plans are? And so when I was talking about simulation or discrete event modeling, is can we start to look at what would happen? Think of your network map in your head. You have manufacturers or distributors here, 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 and here. Like, just visually right now in your head, you can think, or pick a company, what happens if I take this DC offline? Or what happens if I take this contract manufacturer offline? What is the cascading effect? You can war game that now. You take your whiteboard, you can draw it on the whiteboard, and you can figure that out. And the questions that arise are, well, who are my suppliers in that region? When I just magically shut this DC down, who are my suppliers? What's impacted? What's the disruption to supply, et cetera, on and on. And those are the questions to ask yourself now. Obviously, we can't all answer them now, but those are the questions you want to answer, because then you say, well, if this DC goes offline, then I'm going to reroute traffic this way and that way and do this, and I'm going to take these steps, and I'm going to do longer haul from this DC down here to ensure that, because all of that stuff happens today in a crisis, but it's just because we get a bunch of people together in a war room and everybody's like exchanging Excel files, or this story, which I loved, after the tariffs got enacted, companies are scrambling, doing these firefighting or crash efforts to figure out, take their bombs, figure out which pieces are getting manufactured in which countries and where the assembly is happening, to see what the impact of the tariff is. That should be a push button exercise that says this. It shouldn't take more than a couple hours, because then you just say, oh, all right, well, these components, this subset of this product and this subset of this product is going to be impacted by 20% for the cost. So we need to, but if we actually move the manufacturing here, if this happens, then we have a contingency plan in place. And I love your quote about the generals, because it's ironic, because the generals are always developing battle plans for the last war, but there's always a group that's doing the advanced thinking that never makes its way into the battle plans. Because like the military has been looking at green solutions for quite a number of years, long before corporations were doing it, because we live in industrial war. We live in the age of industrial war. No rubber, no gas, no oil, no metal, no whatever, no war. And increasingly, we're in an information age. So no information, no data, no communications, no war. And so, greening and having sustainability on the battlefield actually is a top priority for commanders. Yet, or at least for DoD planners, Department of Defense planners. Now, that doesn't make its way into actual the war plans, but it's interesting that you have the same organization looking at both, or looking at this and not enacting it. So I always like to look at the military, because they're usually 5 to 10 years ahead in some of these topics.
Now, okay, here's an interesting point with the being ahead. Does that position some companies to, at least if they're in react mode, to shorten their response time to be able to address a crisis? So where would you put the status of the majority of companies that are out there? Non-government, non-military, let's say the private sector, corporate world. What percentage of companies have at least a modicum of pre-war mapping or anticipating what could happen?
Very small amount.
Why is that?
And well, back to your previous question, not data, not the people. It's kind of a build on our previous discussion. They don't have the data. There's excuses why they don't have the data. They don't have people looking at it. You have middle managers that are just managing to par. They're not trying to excel. They're I take special exception with the middle managers that don't want to drive excellence. They just want to float along till retirement. There's a lot of reasons, and you see this, especially when we're talking predominantly about risk right now, or risk in the supply base. You predominantly see this is the most of the risk tools are very superficial. They don't get into this detail. They're reactive. They're signal processing at best, and they're almost 100% reactive. Because this is what people won't tell you when it comes to risk: is your greatest risk comes from the places where you have you have the least visibility. So imagine a factory in China. Imagine a recycling center in Seattle. Imagine whatever in South America. There are or a farm or milling facility in Pakistan. You do not have the visibility, and all these solutions that talk about rating, and they scrape news, and they do all this stuff, or even site audits. I love site audits because they're the biggest, like nothing like communicating to people that you're coming to do a site audit only, for them to clean up or move, like the offending things out of the way, as if that, like, anyway, that so all of these things, like, we're very, very immature. So the question we have to ask every time I look at all these risk tools, and I just roll my eyes. Not that they're not good, and not that they're not important, an important step, but they're like step 0 or step 0.5, because we really, like, we have to ask ourselves, are we visualizing the data we have, which is what all those solutions do, or visualizing the data we need? And once we have the data that we need, then once we start having that, then we can visualize it. And it's actually less important to visualize it, and I'm going to use this term again, but it's more important to simulate it. And that's what we are missing in this whole discussion. And I totally forgot your question, because
no, that was that was fine. And we have actually a question from Jenna and another one from Ale. First, Jenna, it feels like my organization is so bogged down by overcomplicated processes and inefficient systems that we are spending all of our time dragging things along that will never get to a place where we can do the work that you're talking about to prepare ourselves to react well at the turn of events. Where do we start? What strategy for change do we take?
Okay, so a few things. One, I mean, this gets back to a lot of different things we talked about, but first and foremost, you need better leaders. And that's not necessarily your job, that's my job. And if you read between the lines in the book, I'm saying we have weak leaders in procurement, and that's got to change, and that is changing. And so that's first. Second, we have to blow up these processes, these very long, I hate quote unquote best practices. And my colleagues, by the way, use these terms, and they're out perpetuating a lot of this stuff. And I'm not always a well-liked person around Carney, but we keep perpetuating these overcomplicated processes. And why do we do this? Is it so that we can ensure that somebody doesn't buy a pen for 8 cents versus 5 cents? We've negotiated, like, if that's, or we're worried about somebody's going to go buy 100 boxes of pens and steal them. Like, that's 1950s, 60s mentality. And in my, I have an article that I wrote, and it got incorporated in the Disruptive Procurement book. But I have an example of, sorry, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent, but like the IT vending machine. So a lot of the companies here in Silicon Valley have a IT vending machine. So instead of standing up a whole IT organization with procurement for all these peripherals, dongles, and cases, they have it all in a vending machine, and you just swipe your badge and get whatever you need. And yes, some idiot is going to go and steal a bunch of AirPods, and you're going to fire them. But do you really? It's trust but verify, because do you really need to create a whole process to ensure that one person doesn't go and steal 5 pairs of AirPods? No, you really need to trust your employees. And I would argue in this day and age, our employees are so much more valuable. Everybody's espousing how valuable our employees are. And yet we can't trust them to make a purchase of an airline ticket or AirPods or whatever. I mean, come on, let's, like we have to move into this new sort of era of trust. And so all of that's to say, to answer your question in a long way, I guarantee you 60, 70, 80% of your processes are trying to solve problems that are based on faulty assumptions. And so if you have the right leader, they will challenge that and really work to break those processes. And you see that Cyril at BT is known for this, and others. And I gave that quote from Fair Market. If you're not trying to blow these things up, you're not doing the right things. And I don't mean that you specifically, but as an organization.
Right.
So that's not our remit. Yeah. Anyway.
So for Jenna, where you start is not being ridiculous with processes that strangle everybody. What's the old saying? Penny wise, pound foolish. Those kinds of approaches, and find the right leader. Now, if you don't have the right leadership and you happen to know that there's a problem with that, then that's another discussion, isn't it?
Well, and why do you want to work for that person? Right? I know there's a lot of reasons why, but I mean, if my choice is going to work in marketing or working for a subpar procurement leader, I'm going to work in marketing. I'll reinvent myself in marketing before I'll work with a poor CPO and a bad leader. And that's why I take a very aggressive, and I will take my book and swat at them for being recalcitrant and being embedded in past ideology. I'm not having it. And it doesn't mean I'm 100% right. And it doesn't mean it's going to change overnight, but that's what I advocate for.
Well, you're going to enjoy this question from Ale then. He said, how can you convert leaders that don't believe in certain digital tools like supplier discovery tools like Teal? And is there any tool that can help visualize or compare supplier data so I can sell the story of the value of the tools? So this is a leadership ebbing into technology issue, isn't it?
Yeah, no, certainly. And on an optimistic note, I will say a lot more leaders are understanding this, and or at least stepping to the side and not saying no, it's a Reba or nothing. So I think that position has softened, even if they don't fully understand it. But if I'm sitting where you're sitting, all of these startups and we haven't really talked about the elephant in the room, but there's billions and billions of dollars being funneled into startups. There are lots and lots of startups that are willing to work with you. And I've watched startups in all these realms. So the scenario you just described will absolutely sit down and work with you and help you make that case. And some are more mature and they may not do it, but others are a lot of just starting out entrepreneurs, and I talk to a lot of them. They would love to get into your organization, whatever it is, and help them along. And that's why I really think this whole evolution of startups is, and I talk about the sort of seed funding, Series A, Series B, Series C, and the sort of drivers for them, the motivators. And if you catch them early on, they'll work with you to make that case to your CPO. And the CPOs are waking. I mean, Cyril is sort of a celebrity / rock star at BT and on LinkedIn and everywhere else because he harnessed this power. And so people see that. People hear me talk and realize, hey, I can make myself relevant. And at the same time, you have CEOs and CFOs asking very tough questions of, wait a minute, why is my plant shut down because we don't have PPE? And or I was going to make this point earlier, this idea of just in time, like that got obliterated pretty quickly. And that's the opening story of the book is like the executives really start to see this weak kind of lazy mail it in leadership. So, but to answer your more pressing question, I pair either if you can do it with yourself or amongst your team, If not, do it that way or work with these folks because they'll be more than happy to work with you.
And doesn't it make it easier to introduce new technology? Because unlike the old days of ERPs where you dealt with months and years and tens of millions of dollars, now you're dealing with weeks and even days and pay by the drink. So you don't have that same risk factor. So you get a chance to actually, you can prove it on a smaller scale and build out.
Exactly. And that's the way to go, is, and especially if you have a small amount of budget, pay as you go, try it with a handful of suppliers or try before you buy. Most startups, charge a nominal fee, which I think is fair, more than fair. But certainly this sort of try with low cost, keep the risk down. I mean, if you can't afford that, then you have a leadership problem and you should go work for marketing. I'm not sure how I came up with marketing, but yeah, it becomes this, it is not a 6 or 7 or 8 figure thing. It's a 10 grand, 15, 20 grand kind of endeavor, and it should show value. I started by saying 3 to 6 weeks, show me some value, and if it doesn't work, great, we learned something very, very valuable. That 10 grand or 20 grand, that what I learned is worth way more than that cash outlay. And if it does succeed, then okay, we've built momentum and we can start to drive this in. And it's not the big sell. It's like, very lightweight, low touch kind of thing.
See, by the way, your instincts are in prime condition because Gartner reported a couple of years ago that chief marketing officers will actually spend more on IT than CIOs will be spending. So obviously your instincts are right there. Let's go to the third segment in terms of this.
And I just say though, that also just on the CIO thing, because it's also heads of supply chain, CPOs will spend more on technology than CIOs will. And CIOs lost the battle with marketing and they have a death grip on supply chain. And I think one of the trends we need to sort of see is either a greater partnership and with the CIO and the head of supply chain or CPO, or a disintermediation and getting them out of our business. Anyway.
Okay, I think that's a good point to know. And it kind of segues into this next one. And this was interesting. For a series of studies over a 6 to 7 year periods, found that the majority of CPOs, about 50 to 60% of CPOs consistently year over year, do not believe that their procurement teams possess the necessary skills to deliver on their strategic objectives. Is procurement equipped for this brave new world and its challenges? If not, how do procurement professionals get up to speed? Is it the professionals who are left wanting, or is it the leadership that isn't utilizing the skills? Like where's this disconnect? Because ultimately it comes down to, much like you're saying, at the front line, boots on the ground area. No?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of culture, and it's certainly, it's a lot of culture and it's a lot of leadership, and it starts there. I think the people in procurement, by and large, and I think the people on this, and I know a lot of the folks on today's call are in the foundry because I watch a lot of the chats in the foundry. I think the people are there. I think the enablement is often not there. And by enablement, I mean the leadership and the culture that pushes for these changes, pushes for blowing up processes. I heard this term permissionless procurement today, and I love that. And that's a significant level of trust. And it's putting this trust into the systems themselves, and it's trusting that. But I also think our education in procurement is weak. It's really weak. And the ISM, SIPs, SIG, yeah, you take any organization, you look at their curriculums, they're regurgitating stuff from 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Those are not the skills you need. And many of the skills I argue, you cannot learn them in a learning management system. You have to want to learn them. And if you want to learn them, you'll go teach yourself. Or you will go talk to somebody. And I see this in Procurement Foundry. I see this within Carney. I see this within organizations of, hey, John, I really want to visualize this thing. Can you help me? Or I have some personal visualizations that I do in my outside of work, and I couldn't figure it out. I just emailed Tableau support because I was highly motivated to do this. And here I am, a person that's just doing this, periodically ad hoc. Like I can learn this because there's the information's out there if you want to go get it. And we too often incentivize, meaning, hey, if you get this certification, you'll get this bump in raise, or theoretically at least. If we take all these classes and we do all this continuing ed credit, well, what are you really learning in those things? I would argue not very much, because the whole previous conversation when I got on my soapbox about the data and what we do with it and forward looking, those are the kinds of things we need to be teaching ourselves, doing, operating. And you can't learn that in a tool, in a learning management system. You can't learn that at fill in the blank industry organization. The content's just not there. And don't take my word for it, go look at it and you tell me if I'd be glad to be proven wrong, but I know, at least for the one organization I'm associated with, and I know that's not true. I mean, I know that they don't have remotely the modern curriculum, but Carney co-host a European CPO roundtable for financial institutions, and unprompted by me, and I know everybody will think I prompted this, but somebody brought up the fact that all the organizations do a terrible job, all the professional industry organizations do a terrible job at advancing beyond the basics of this is a 7-step sourcing process, this is category management. Beyond that, they to a person said that it's so kind of an epidemic because you're not getting the continuing ed. And by the way, I've just been talking about digital. Don't forget, there's a whole bunch of ESG stuff around carbon tracking and scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, like the 3 emissions. These things aren't in curriculums today, and they're just going to take a long time before they get there.
Right, the carbon credits and how organizations are innovatively using those to make new acquisitions of computers by making the older computers going out available to, let's say, school districts who don't have a huge budget. Now, this is an interesting point. One of the things that I thought about as you were talking, Eloise, is that change is ultimately not going to necessarily, and just reading your book, it's not going to come from the top down, it's going to come from the bottom up. Because if you think about it, and one of the things you talked about CIOs, and let's go back to that, there was a survey done of CIOs, and they asked, how many apps do you have in an active, in your organization? And projects underway, and many of them said, well, we only have about 150, 200. They turned out to have 958 different apps and different experiments going on. So that would tell me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of the frontline people, a lot of the people that they're saying may not possess the abilities or are involved in the day-to-day, are taking the initiative themselves to solve problems. I mean, is that an indication of change upward rather than downward?
Yeah, I mean, we think that, I mean, first of all, having 950 apps is actually a good thing, but the CIO ideology, or maybe this is the difference between CIO and CDO, Chief Digital Officer, is this fear of complexity. You know, IT management's all about streamlining, simplifying, reducing, whatever that word you want to use is. But look at your iPhone or your Android device. You know, how many apps do you have on it? Do you even know? How many, like, especially if you have kids, I mean, forget it. You have more apps than you even realize, which is kind of problematic on a security front, but that's a different issue. And so we are attuned to complexity. And so this is how you know a real CIO from one that's about ready to go out to pasture or retire, is because they're embracing this change. And if you're not going to give it to the business, then you're going to lose. You're going to lose that every time. And these CIOs that hold on to SAP as we're going to move to SAP, one SAP instance, and then we're going to be digital. That's not digital. That's just complexity reduction. And so, and we've seen this for the last 2 decades in Salesforce on the sales side, sales and marketing side of the business. If you have an enabling platform like Salesforce, you can then have all the hundreds of apps, which if you're the CIO, you don't care about the hundreds of apps because you have this overarching platform that keeps everything sort of in a sandbox or auditable or at least sort of logically contained. That's where my biggest argument, that's where procurement's going. My next argument's going to be that's where ERPs are going. And that's the way forward, because one solution, I'm going to drag these, anybody that says closed loop suite system end to end is working in an old paradigm, and we need to be more enabling platform. iOS, Android, Salesforce, even AWS and Azure are enabling platforms. And then you have the constraints and the boundaries that should make a CIO happy, and then you can go crazy.
So in essence, that ties into your permissionless reality there. In other words, better ask forgiveness than permission kind of scenario.
Well, or trust and verify, right?
Trust and verify.
And the permissionless procurement is really, have we designed the systems so that we don't have to be in the middle of the transaction? That's really what it's getting at. And by the way, I didn't come up with that. Natasha Foster, the co-founder of Paid, came up with that this morning. But that, yeah, that's what we mean, is we don't have to be in the middle of the purchasing process.
Got it. Well, now we've got about maybe 14 minutes left. I certainly want to encourage anyone to ask questions relative to Eloise's book and what we've talked about today. How would you sum up what we've talked about in these three segments: the high level conceptual idea, the industry-wide idea, and then the individual? How would you sum it all up for somebody saying we've got to affect change? Change is either going to come to us or we're going to get ahead of it. What would you say?
I would say this is great. I mean, if you're not excited to be in procurement, I'm excited just talking about this. And I'm disappointed there's only 13 minutes left, because I could talk about this for 4 hours or, on and on. And I do every day. I talk about this stuff in varying degrees. And this is great. I mean, so to sum it all up now is the greatest time to be in procurement for these very reasons, because you can, to the question that whoever asked the question earlier about how do you get started if you have all these processes and systems. And when I'm talking about the fact that you can go to all these startups and work in partnership with them, like, that's amazing. That doesn't happen on the sales and marketing side, not to the same degree. That already happened in the past. That happened between 2010 and 2020. Now is our time. So if you have the desire, if you have the interest, this is the time to be in procurement and or supply chain. And the flip side of that is now's our time. And if we don't get it right now, that's on us, because then we're going to get disintermediated, like the CIO has gotten disintermediated and continues to get disintermediated. And people are just going to buy through exchanges or without our participation. And so that's why I think, to sum it up, is be motivated. If you're a leader, get the culture set right and learn. And this is, again, this is not an undue plug for the Procurement Foundry, but this is why I wrote about the Procurement Foundry, is the idea that we have a community, a professional community. To me, this is like one of the biggest breakthroughs, having been in this industry for over 20 years or been in this profession and watching this. We were all in silos. We can't talk to anybody. And just in the stroke of 2020, with Procurement Foundry really hitting its mark, this showed us that the fact we're all internetworked, and the stories I write about it, the idea that we can share. And Larry, I see you there, the help that we offer one another, and I've watched Larry help others and be a resource, and John and you and Mike and others like this, and Steph's on the call. We're all helping one another, and I've never seen that in years past. It's all about puffing up egos and the arrogance, and you can see the old school, because they come in with egos that are twice the size of mine, and mine's pretty big, but they dwarf my ego, and they're just arrogant, and you see that, and they talk in theoretical, and they talk down to you, talk down to me. It's like, so that's if I were to sum it up, I would say, procurement's cool, and now's our time, so embrace it.
We're part of a community. We have a question. How do these principles apply for software technology procurement?
Yes, yeah. So, and I do work with a number of client software clients. First, I would say, even if you're in the software business, there's a high probability you will make an acquisition, and then you'll have a hardware piece to your supply chain. So that's one piece of it. But the second piece is your spend is going to be, so don't dismiss the sort of hard goods supplier supply chain type stuff. However, if you are just solely a software provider, your spend profile is going to be a lot more in professional services and facilities management, and so those become your strategic tier one suppliers. You're very much like financial institutions, banks, insurance, and so forth, and that's good. And so that changes. And actually, I've been doing a lot of work with software companies lately. So it means how do you engage? Certainly, your tier one providers are going to be your cloud providers, assuming you're not the cloud provider. And what are you doing with them to deal with SLAs? Or maybe that your engineering teams deal with that. But what about all the other stuff? And what about the facilities management? I saw this with one company, is they were doing full on MSAs for the provider of snacks to the break room, like the company that brings in organic fruit every day. You don't need an MSA for the company providing fruit to your kitchen every day, or the catering, or these things. So it's a little bit of balancing and segmenting the work you do. And in some ways, if you have the right marketplace, you should just let your users buy the office supplies they want, the tech supplies they want, the software they want, in a way, in conjunction with the business, however the CIO defines it, or the marketing people define it, and define the guardrails, and work to enable that, instead of, oh, I want to use Airtable, or I want to use Dropbox. Well, here are the 50 requisitions you need to fill out. You need these approvals, and we've never used Airtable before, so we got to onboard them as a supplier. So 30 days later, it's like, and this is why people pull out their credit cards and go swipe and start using it. So, so it's really looking at that spend profile, segmenting your suppliers, and really ensuring that you have the right controls for your tier one suppliers, but you're not putting an undue burden on the fruit supplier.
All right. Well, now with the last few minutes, and that answered the question. Last few minutes, let's talk about your next book. Let's give a little, because I think you have at least the next book or another 2 books that are coming out, and let's talk about that direction, following up on this most recent one. Can you give us a hint?
I can. And do you want to contextualize where the next book is coming from?
No, I'm going to put it. I'll wait and listen to you.
Okay. So so my next book is going to my premise is that our end-to-end supply chains are really made up of third parties. Aside from, say, planning, everything else, and I alluded to it earlier, is third parties. So my next book is really going to look at how do we build secure, green, resilient, and innovative, and socially just, shall we say, supply chains. And to do that, we need a fundamentally new architecture. And it's a build, and it's, some might say, reductive from my current book, but it is a build, because end-to-end supply chain is far more complicated than simply source to pay. It was easy to take down the source to pay providers, because they had built themselves a house of cards to be of the great empires that have fallen. And it just took a little bit of wind and it knocked them over. But the big ERP is like an empire waiting to fall. And so in my next book, I'm really going to talk about how we think about third-party management with all of those those different disciplines, and really talking about how we look at risk from these points of view, sustainability from this end-to-end point of view, how we look at analytics, because there is so much misinformation. And I want to do it, and it's going to be story-based. So it's all going to be, because there's a lot of great examples. And when I present, I've used some of them. Those of you that have seen my Civil War adoption of technology, my World War I adoption of technology, some of these stories, or AI with the stealth drone that landed itself in Iran. So there's lots of stories. I'm going to use those kinds of stories to illustrate these points and argue for a new way of operating.
See, and of course, we're excited because it's going to come out under the Procurement Foundry Press banner, which is very exciting for us. So we're looking forward to that as well. Now, I was going to pass it over to Tina Noble to go through the sign off and whatnot, but we have one last question from Larry. Does your idea of green include repair? Planned obsolescence has been the go-to for the last couple of decades and likely continues to be. However, I'd love to see things being able to be repaired.
Yeah, so I am actually in my next book. This is one of those So one of the topics that is really emerging and needs fleshing out is reverse logistics. And part of reverse logistics, there's many parts to reverse logistics. And one of them is not only getting the sort of packaging materials back, the whatever you can reclaim from what was delivered. It's also bringing that data back upstream, because we need that data to feed in to build the feedback loop. How many end-to-end, don't worry, Larry, I'll answer your question in a second, but how many end-to-end those of us raised in plan, source, make, deliver, it's one direction, as Larry sort of asked. And so how do we think about both the reverse logistics, and the other part is right to repair. And I have a brilliant story about that I'm going to illustrate this point with, is how do I really have to get a new device? Nobody really likes getting new, I mean, not nobody, but like, is this a pain to have to re-get my new machine? And wouldn't it be great if I could just get that new operating system and those new features without having to send the phone back? I just, before this call, got a note that says, you have an old iPhone on the corporate plan. You have to go, send it back. So I have to go find it and send it back. And then, of course, I have all these plugs and chargers and cases that, because I bought that, or because Carney gave me the new phone, I now have to go buy new ones. I don't want to do any of that. And so, and my wife, she's on an iPhone 5. She's finally moving to, a newer iPhone. And so I think as consumers, we don't want to do this. And so I think as we think about circular supply chains, we have to think about the path to repair, sustain, whatever, whatever that term is, as well as the reverse logistics. So yes, Larry, I'm going to focus squarely on that. And I'm not the only one, because Congress and the judicial branches are both looking at that too.
All right. Well, thank you for that last question, Larry. And you're right. The time flew by very, very quickly. We could probably go another hour. Dr. Eloise Epstein, thank you so much for joining us today on Author Chat. And we look forward to that next book. With great anticipation. And now I'll just turn it back over to you, Tina, to do the official sign off. And again, everyone, thank you for tuning in. And we appreciate the time you gave us this evening. And hopefully you got a great deal from the experience. Thank you.
And let me just say thank you to everybody for great questions. Great. Thank you, John, for this. And I really enjoyed doing this chat. So this was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Everybody, thank you very much for joining us. This is a fantastic first time. It was a huge hit. I'm very excited about it. If anybody has any questions, I know everybody got their books. They got the actual book. So I'm sure if they have any questions, they can reach out to you inside of Slack, Dr. Eloise. If there's any that they have to talk about about the book or anything, I'm sure they'll be able to reach out. But I look forward to the next one. I cannot wait. We do have this recorded. If anybody missed a little bit or anything, I'm sure we can share that as well. But John, thank you. You did a fantastic job. It's a great discussion between friends, and I look forward to seeing everybody soon.
Thank you.
Great.
care,
Thank
everyone.
Thanks,
you.
guys. Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.